we go, guys. My favorite console of all time, the Sega Dreamcast. This is something that has had me particularly excited about doing a Summer of Sega because I've been getting into this system more and more as time goes on. I've accumulated a lot of great games and finally got my hands a few months back on a Japanese Dreamcast, so I've finally been able to get into the Japanese side of things and play a lot of games that didn't get released here because while initially the Dreamcast was actually a little more successful in North America. It had a really big burst in that sort of that 99.99 plan they had going on over here. It actually lasted longer in Japan game-wise. Console-wise, again, didn't sell quite as well as North America, but it seemed to be sort of kind of drop off the face of the earth once Sega announced they were no longer going to support the Dreamcast. While in Japan, and particularly amongst smaller publishers, smaller developers, a lot of people making a lot of digital comics, a lot of sort of visual novels, a lot of smaller RPGs. We're continuing to support the Dreamcast for several years after that, to the point where the Dreamcast's library is comparable to something like the GameCube, which lasted much longer, and it's over 2/3 the size of the original Xbox's library system, which again lasted much longer. I'm really enjoying this system, and I've had sort of an interesting history with it where it had never reached this point of being my favorite system until recently, but in some ways, if I had sort of played things out a little differently as a teenager, this could have always been my favorite system of all time. I got into the Dreamcast after I got my PlayStation 2, but it had been something that was on my radar. Again, I said I had very little experience with the Genesis in the beginning. I just had a handful of games. I completely missed out on the Saturn. But something in all those articles and commercials and just something about the look and the feel of the Dreamcast really intrigued me from the beginning. Just looking at pictures and magazines, it was already and still is my favorite console of all time as far as just the way the system looks. And there are a lot of great limited editions I would like to get, and I really like the look of the Sega Sports one, besides the fact that it says, sports on it, the black one that we got over here in North America. But my favorite design of all time, my favorite looking console ever is still that original white Dreamcast, and I actually do overall prefer, I don't have a PAL one yet, but the blue PAL swirl for the Dreamcast, I think that's the prettiest one overall against the white, but the North American red and the Japanese orange still look fantastic. And I don't know why it's my favorite. There's something about it that just appeals to me. The Saturn, as said, is my second favorite console of all time as far as how it looks, hardware-wise. And the Dreamcast, for some reason, just something about it really appeals to me, and I really like the pristine sort of white colored consoles, even though they're the hardest to really keep in good shape. They tend to yellow over the years, and I wish it was easier to care for the white consoles, but for some reason I really just love the look of this. And to go along with the hardware again, it also has my favorite controller of all time, the Dreamcast controller. And from the first time, the story of how I got my Dreamcast was I put off getting it initially just because of the announcement of the PlayStation 2, because I was a huge PS1 guy, and as much as I kind of wanted the Dreamcast, I didn't have a lot of Sega experience, and it was a choice between the two. So I put it off, and when I got my Dreamcast, I went into a store not intending to get one. I had saved up a bunch of money to go and buy a bunch of PS2 games. I was kind of looking for even some new releases, which back then I usually tended to buy mostly used because of, obviously you're a teenager, you don't have tons of money. But I'd saved up a lot of money, I was looking through the games, and I noticed they were basically giving away their Dreamcast consoles and games. Everything was on clearance, and they just kind of wanted to get rid of it. So instead I said, well, I could get this handful of games, or I could get a brand new console plus as many games as I was going to get for my PS2. So I went ahead and did that, and kind of got everything they had that appealed to me. And that was kind of it for a very long time for the Dreamcast for me, because I really didn't have an avenue to purchase or even look through a lot of retro games for a long time. And I took it home and instantly fell in love with this thing, and was sad for a long time that I really couldn't get more into it. And eventually, when I had access to more games, I still didn't get that into it just because I had so many PS2 games, and I had a GameCube, and I had an Xbox, and all this other stuff. It just kind of fell to the wayside for a while. And I feel that if I had made a different decision and had originally gone with the Dreamcast, I was initially going to get it in 2000 and pushed back till 2001 when I got my PS2. If I had grabbed Christmas 2000 a Dreamcast instead of the PS2 and stuck with it, I think this would have been from day one my favorite console of all time. I remember taking it home and opening the box and pulling this thing out and really seeing this console in person and just realizing, wow, it's not just the pictures. This thing, for me, is the perfect design. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it from just my perception, how I like it visually, how I like just the way it feels, how I like the sort of the curves of it, where the top is not perfectly flat. There's this gentle curve up the top, how the corners are all sort of rounded off. There's something about the different textures and colors and just the general layout of the console that I really enjoyed. And then for the first time ever, I put my hands on the Dreamcast controller. And to be honest, at first I didn't think I would like it because it had just the one analog stick on the side there, and the design was a little odd. I mean, if you think about it, compare this to if you've never touched a Saturn 3D controller and the original Xbox wasn't out yet. There was nothing quite like this that had a slightly different shape to it than a lot of controllers that were out at the time. But as soon as I just put it in my hands, it just felt perfect. For some reason, just the way the controller is structured compared to the size and shape of my hands, everyone has completely different hand structure, different lengths of fingers, you're all built differently, so there's no perfect controller. For me, this just fits in my hands perfectly, and I really, really enjoyed it. I actually prefer just the one analog stick. It's something where it could have hurt it in the long run, especially with the rise of first-person shooters, but I've even had experience with a lot of first-person shooters where somehow this controller made it work with just the one analog stick. Playing Quake 3, playing Unreal Tournament, for some reason, it actually really works if you just tweak with the controls, and some of those even support keyboard and mouse. But anyway, the point is, my favorite controller of all time, fell in love with it immediately, and it has always been my favorite. And then I pulled out, I bought alongside of it, of course, you need a memory card, so I got this VMU. And I didn't know much about it besides what I read in magazines, but alright, it's a cool kind of like maybe gimmicky little thing, but this is, for me, I feel the coolest accessory ever made for a console. It's amazing. Not only is it a memory card, but it has so many different functions. When you have it plugged into your console, many times it'll turn on a game, you put it in the controller, and the logo of the game will appear up on screen, or when you select a character, a little version of your character will show up there. Or a lot of games, especially survival horror, they'll kind of clear up the HUD on the screen, especially if it's ported from an older system, and instead things like your health will appear on the VMU. And there are more uses where certain games you can select strategies on the VMU so it's not showing that to your opponents, or little messages will show up, or even if you play Sakura Tyson 3 and you're in Paris, and Sakura uses this as sort of a pager from Tokyo, where you actually have to answer the VMU and little messages will stream across and will scroll across the VMU. And then you get into even further functions where in many games you can access certain mini games where you pull out the VMU and it becomes its own little mini portable console thing. It's like a souped up Tamagotchi type thing here. And a lot of games with those mini games, they're not only kind of an extra little fun thing on their side, what really makes them worthwhile is that when you play these games and you do things on these games and plug it back into the controller, many times it will affect the main game, giving you certain bonuses, giving you tons extra money, giving you all these different effects, and many companies really put a lot of use into the VMU. It's something where I feel like, luckily, from the developer side, it wasn't seen as a gimmick, it was seen as an opportunity, so it was used appropriately. It wasn't something that had stupid little features thrown in. It actually is an essential component of this entire package. I love the VMU, everything about this hardware-wise instantly became my favorite of all time, even as I only had a few games and got into things like the PS2 and the Xbox and moving further on, even compared to older systems. From the first time I opened the box, the Dreamcast, hardware-wise, was my favorite console ever, always has been. Absolutely loved it. The sort of Achilles heel for this thing when I first got it, though, was the fact that until maybe 2.5 years ago, the only games I had for the Dreamcast were what I picked up that day with the console. That was it. And I really enjoyed them, and from the start, I fell in love with the Dreamcast, and like I said, even if I had just had more access back then to games, it probably would have been my favorite console of all time. What I started off with was Sonic Adventure, of course, the sort of guaranteed first game you get for the Dreamcast. Virtua Fighter 3, Soul Calibur, Crazy Taxi, Space Channel 5, and of course Shenmue. And I am so grateful that this just happened to be there that day in the store. Otherwise, I never would have experienced this and probably wouldn't know what Shenmue was to this day. I'm so incredibly lucky that this just happened to be sitting there amongst these other games. And just, I remember this was actually the game I put off till last to play when I got my Dreamcast. I played it over a weekend where I had, I think I had a track meet on Saturday, and then I was off Sunday, so I had about a day and a half to check it out. And I really enjoyed things like Space Channel 5 and Crazy Taxi and had a lot of fun. Virtua Fighter 3 was good. Soul Calibur was fantastic. This was probably my most played game that weekend, and Sonic Adventure really got into, and that whole week it actually took me, I think it was something like 2 weeks before I touched Shenmue. I didn't even open it. It was in its packaging for almost 2 weeks because I was busy playing mostly Soul Calibur and Sonic Adventure. And then right around that same time, my friend Matt also got a Dreamcast with a handful of games, and he had a few that I didn't have. Most notably would be the game I picked up immediately when I started getting back into the Dreamcast was Sword of the Berserk Guts Rage. And if you know the manga or the anime at all, check out this game. This is like hugely underrated sort of hidden gem on the Dreamcast, and honestly it's one of the best games on the system. It's fantastic. It's so much fun, and I wish I had this, but luckily I got to play it over at his house a couple times, and a few other games, but that was sort of it. And eventually then I opened up Shenmue and immediately fell in love. It's something that the first time I played it, it entered into one of my favorite games of all time, and it's still one of my favorite games of all time. And I enjoyed it, and I loved it, and I finished it, and then it was done. Dreamcast for me was done. I already got the system after it was pretty much dead, and that was it. That was my Dreamcast experience for many years, and it was sort of just this fond memory. It was hardware-wise, favorite console ever, had some amazing experiences with some great games, but a handful of games doesn't compare to having huge PS2 collections. Is mostly what you see behind me is most like PS2 stuff, and like GameCube, and like I have Xboxes over there, and PS1 and the N64 and all that other stuff. There's so many other games that the Dreamcast just became sort of a fond memory. And finally, as I got more into Sega and got more into playing things on the Genesis and learning more about the Saturn, I really got into learning more about the Dreamcast just in this moment where I was organizing my consoles as we were rearranging the whole apartment and living room. I used to have my consoles out on these shelves, sort of on display, and then we ended up having too many consoles to do that, and I ended up putting them in this big TV hutch that we have in place of where the movies used to be. And as I was moving them around, I'm like, you know what? I really want to play this more often, and I hadn't touched it in quite a long time. So I started playing a couple games on it. I think the first thing I played was Soul Calibur, and really just sort of remembering how much I enjoyed those first experiences, and really reminiscing and remembering, wow, you know what? Shenmue wasn't finished. Shenmue was an incredible game, and I had an interesting experience with Shenmue where, because I didn't really do anything online with gaming, it really didn't have any Dreamcast magazines, I really wasn't paying attention to a lot of news. I never knew Shenmue 2 existed since we didn't get it on the Dreamcast in North America. And to show the impact that Dreamcast and Shenmue had on me, the entire reason I got an original Xbox was because I walked into a store one day and I saw Shenmue 2 sitting on the shelf. I had no idea that thing existed, and I had actually had a stack of games in my hand, and I remember I saw that and I said, holy crap, I put all those games I was going to buy back on the shelf, grabbed Shenmue 2, went up to the counter and asked if they had an original Xbox for sale. And that's the story of how I got my Xbox, was because of Dreamcast and Shenmue. And that, remembering those experiences, really just reminiscing about those good times, made me want to relive that and made me want to explore and go deeper into, you know what, this thing had the potential to be my favorite system of all time, and maybe it still has that potential. And I started going back and getting more into the library of games, And although my library of games is still fairly small, I mean, I have way more games on something like PS1 or PS2, it's already become my favorite of all time, simply because I enjoy playing the games on the Dreamcast more. And I'm really enjoying everything that I found, a lot of the exclusives, a lot of the hidden gems, and especially getting into that Japanese library. And there's just something about this system that I love. It's something about it that's always intrigued me, and what really, I think, put it over the edge, where even though it doesn't have the collection yet that some of these other systems do, when I would sit down and play a game on another system, part of me in the back of my mind, every time I was playing something that I really, really enjoyed, everything that I was having a lot of fun with, for some reason, there'd be this thought in my mind where I would say, man, I wish this was on the Dreamcast. And that's when I realized that this was, in actuality, my favorite system of all time, and it was just going to continue to grow. That admiration for this console, this love for this console, the way the controller feels, the VMU, the way the system looks, the types of games, just everything about it. When I realized that no matter how much I like a game, it didn't make me like the console it was on more. It made me wish it was on the Dreamcast more. And that's when I realized Dreamcast, favorite system of all time, and as the collection grows, it becomes more and more my favorite. Sega Dreamcast, if you guys have never experienced it, please go out and get one and just grab a couple games. There's over 700 games released worldwide, I think almost 800 total. Tons of fantastic games, and a relatively cheap system to collect for, in all honesty. There are particular games that are incredibly expensive, but overall you can build a decent library plus a system and a couple controllers and things easily under $100, so you can get at least a start with this console. I absolutely love it. Sega Dreamcast, favorite system of all time. What are your experiences with the Dreamcast, and what is your favorite system of all time? I'd love to know. I'd love to know if you had a similar experience, a similar feeling with a different console, where the first time you picked it up and put that controller in your hand, you just knew something about it clicked with you personally. Was it like the Super Nintendo or the GameCube or the PS2? Like, what was that system for you? Was it the Dreamcast? Dreamcast, absolutely love it. A lot more to come. It's going to be a staple of the channel, and I'm going to have a lot of talks about Dreamcast over the summer with the Summer of Sega, and I can't wait to do this. I'm so excited, finally getting more into the Dreamcast and the Saturn and the Genesis and getting a Sega CD. Summer of Sega is it's a lot of fun for me already, and it's not even been a full month. I'm just absolutely enjoying it. Favorite system of all time, the Sega Dreamcast.